Hello, welcome to Chapter 12, Lesson 6. Today we're going to be talking about measurement. Okay, measuring to the nearest 1/2 inch and measuring to the nearest 1/4 inch. Okay, I'm trying to think of how best to do this without being in front of you with a ruler. So if you could get your rulers out, that would be helpful. You can just pause the video, go grab your ruler, get it out, and we could be looking at that, okay? So 1/2 inch is one of two equal parts of a 1 inch. There are two 1/2 inches in 1 inch. So if this is the 1 inch mark, halfway between that is the 1/2 inch mark. Okay, this part right here would be 1 and 1/2, right? And then it would be our 2 inch mark. So if we're measuring, we always go to the whole number first and then we add on the half. So that would be 1 and 1/2. Let's do some practice here. So if we wanted to measure the length of 3 connecting cubes, here they are, to the nearest 1/2 inch. So I'm going to line up an inch ruler so that the end of the first cube is at the 0 mark. Notice it's not always the end of the ruler. We have to make sure we're going with that 0 line and lining it up. The length of the 3 cubes is greater than 2 whole inches. Do you see that? It passes the 2. So kind of like when we were talking about time. If it passes the 1, but it hasn't touched the 2 yet, we know it's 2 something. If it passes the 4 and it hasn't touched the 5 yet, we know it's 5:30 or 5:15, right? So same goes here. It has passed the 2, so we knew it's 2 and something inches. So let's look. Oh, here we go. Halfway between 2 and 3 is 2 and 1/2. Okay, but less than 3 inches. So it measures the first mark, write the length, 2 and 1/2 inches. Okay, the length is closer to 2.5 inches than it is to 2 inches or 3 inches. So the nearest 1/2 inch is 2 and 1/2 inches. Now, that's a good point that I haven't talked about yet. If we're measuring to the nearest 1/2 inch and it lands directly on 2, we count that, right? So it's every 1/2 inch we count. So this would be a 1/2, this would be 1 inch. But again, it's just 1/2 inch more. This would be 1.5, 2 inches, 2.5, 3 inches. So any of those options, it could be. So when it says to the nearest 1/2 inch, it's either going to be a whole or a half. Okay, kind of like I was just talking about. 1/2, 1. 1.5, 2. 2.5, 3. It's going to be one of those, either a half or a whole. Measuring to the nearest 1/4 inch, which quarter is another way to say 1/4. Okay, allows you to be even more precise in your measurement. Now, can we remember quarter? How I do is that there are 4 quarters in $1. Okay, the whole dollar, you can split it into 4 quarters, and so they would each be worth 1/4 of a dollar. Okay, 1/4 inch is one of 4 equal parts of 1 inch. Count the spaces, not the lines. Okay, so yeah, they're saying, look, here, there's 1, 2, 3 lines only. But we're really talking about the spaces. So this would be 1/4, 1/2, 3/4, 1 whole. Okay, there are 4 1/4 inches in 1 inch. So on your ruler, between every whole number, so this would be like 0, 1, 2. Okay, we cut it in 1/2, which is the second longest line. So this would be worth 1/2 an inch. This would be worth 1 and 1/2 inch. And then there are some smaller lines. I think yours might cut into 1/8. So the first one is 1/4. Then we have 1/2, which is also a 1/4 inch. And then we have 3/4. Okay, now I passed the 1, so this is going to be 1 and 1/4. 1.5, 1 and 3/4. So once I pass the 2, it's going to be 2 and 1/4, 2 and 1/2, 2 3/4, and so on. Okay? So if we are going to measure the length of the fish to the nearest 1/4 inch, first we're going to measure the length. The length of the fish is greater than 1 hole. See, here's 1, but it's not 2 yet. Okay, so we aren't going to say it's 2 inches. We're going to say it's 1, and then we're going to put our fraction, but less than 2 inches. It measures slightly shorter than the 3rd mark after 1 inch, right? So we're going to write a number to represent the whole inches. Write a fraction to represent the remaining part of an inch. Okay, so our whole inches are 1. Our fraction is 3/4. So the 3rd line right here is 3/4. 1 3/4. This longer line is 1 1/2. And then this one is 1 1/4, just like we talked about before. So it goes 1/4, 1/2, 3/4. 1/4, 1/2, 3/4. 1 1/4, 1 1/2, 1 3/4. 2, 2 1/4, 2 1/2, 2 3/4. I mean, it's a pattern. It just keeps going on and on and on. The length is closer to 1 3/4 inches than it is to 1 1/2 inches or 2 inches. So to the nearest 1/4 inch, the length would be 1 3/4 inches. Okay, refer to the second activity. What is the length of the fish to the nearest 1/2 inch? Okay, so we're not going to look at the tiny ones. We're going to either look at 1, this is 1 1/2, or 2. So what's it closest to? 1 1/2 or 2? It's between those two, right? It's right here is between 1 1/2 and 2. What's it closer to? 1 1/2 inches is what's closer to. How do we know that? Because it is closer? Because it is closer to 1 1/2 inches than 2 inches, right? Closer to 1 1/2 than it is to 2. So that's how I know. Rounding it to, or measuring to the nearest 1/2 inch, it's going to go to 1 1/2. Okay, here I need to measure the length of the bolt to the nearest 1/4 inch. We're going to use all of the dashes, okay? So here's 1/4, 1/2, 3/4, 1, 1 1/4, 1 1/2, 1 3/4, 2 inches. 2 1/4, 2 1/2, 2 3/4, 3. 3 1/4, 3 1/2, 3 3/4. I hope you're getting the pattern. I'm trying to be really redundant so that you're like, I get it, Mrs. Haber. Okay, so right here is where it measures to, which we can notice is the first small hash mark past the 3, which would be 3 1/4 inches. Okay, the length is closer to 3 1/4 inches than it is to 3 inches or 3 1/2 inches, because look at it measures straight up with it. Okay, so 3 1/4 inches is going to be what we choose. Measure the length to the nearest 1/2 inch. Okay, so we're going to look at the holes and the halves. So there's 1/2. Here's 1. Same one you've been counting by since you learned to count. It's not changing, right? Here's 1 1/2. 2. 2 1/2. 3. This would be 3 1/2, and then we'd get 4. Okay, so what's this feather closest to? Look how close it is to 3. It's basically 3. So it's closest to 3 inches. Okay. Measure the length to the nearest 1/4 inch. Okay, so we have got 1/4, 1/2, 3/4, 1. 1 1/4, 1 1/2, 1 3/4, 2. I already passed it. So obviously we can see it measures real close to 1 and 1/4 inches. Okay, problem solving. Measure the length of the marker to the nearest 1/2 inch. Okay, so we're just looking at the longer lines here. I'm going to write them in again, you know it. 0, so this will be 1/2, 1, 1 and 1/2, 2, 2 and 1/2, 3, 3 and 1/2. Okay, so what's it closest to? It's a little over, this would be 3 and 1/4, right? It's a little over 3 and 1/4, so I'd say it's closer to 3 1/2 than it is to 3. So nearest 1/2 inch would be 3 and 1/2 inches. Okay, we really need to make sure we're looking and seeing, okay, this is a 1/2 inch, so I'm only using the bigger marks. If it says 1/4 inch, I'm using all of the little marks on there. Like I said, you might have even smaller ones, breaking them apart, so those would be 1/8. And then if they get even smaller than that, it'd be 1/16. I hope you're seeing a pattern. 1/2, then we have quarters, then we have 1/8, and then we have 1/16, right? Notice, times 2, times 2, they're getting half as small each time, half the size. Okay, number 4, measure the length of the spool of thread to the nearest 1/4 inch. Okay, so I have 1/4, 1/2, 3/4, 1. Okay, so it looks to me like it's closer to 3/4 than 1. So we're going to say it is 3/4 of an inch or 3/4 of an inch. Vocabulary check. How many 1/2 inches are in 1 inch? There are 2, right? How many 1/4 inches are in 1 inch? So we have 1/4, 1/2, 3/4, and then the whole inch. So there are 4. Notice 1/4 inches, 4, 1/2 inches, there are 2, right? We're kind of looking at that denominator to see how many pieces are in the whole, like we've learned with fractions. All right, that's all I have for you today. Thanks for watching.